A man stands in one of the canal locks. 1912. The Panama Canal idea goes back to the 16th century, after understanding the riches of Peru, Ecuador, and Asia, and evaluating the time it took the gold to reach the ports of Spain. It was suggested in 1524 to Charles V that by cutting out a piece of land somewhere in Panama, the trips would be made shorter, and the danger of taking the treasures through the Cape would rationalize such an enterprise. A map of the planned canal. 1910. A survey of the Isthmus was ordered, and subsequently, a working plan for a canal was drawn up in 1529. The wars in Europe and the thirsts for the control of kingdoms in the Mediterranean Sea put the project on permanent hold. French employees of the Panama Canal Company pose for a photograph. 1885. Various surveys were made between 1850 and 1875 showed that only two routes were practical, the one across Panama and another across Nicaragua. Inspired by the 10-year build of the Suez Canal, La Société Internationale du Canal Interoceanique obtained the rights in 1878 to build a version in Panama. Workers gather to receive their wages. 1885. The Colombian government, which controlled Panama, gave permission for the project. Ferdinand de Lesseps headed the fundraising. Jamaican laborers push a wagon of earth along a narrow-gauge railroad. 1885. His success with the Suez Canal helped him raise millions for the new project. Once engineers got to work designing the canal, it became evident that this undertaking would be far more difficult than digging a sea-level ditch through a sandy desert. Workers clear earth by hand. 1900. Though only about 40 miles wide at its narrowest point, the terrain of the isthmus was solid, rocky and mountainous in places. The proposed canal route was intersected by powerful rivers which would need to be diverted. A man stands near dredging equipment abandoned by the French. 1906. And most significantly, tropical diseases were a tremendous health hazard for laborers. Nevertheless, de Lesseps pushed ahead with an optimistic plan for a sea-level canal to be completed in only 6 years at an estimated cost of $120 million. President Theodore Roosevelt sits in the cab of a crane during a visit to the canal construction site. 1906. A labor force of 40,000 men was assembled, composed almost entirely of workers from the West Indies, joined by engineers from France. In 1881, construction began. Interest in a US-led canal effort picked up as soon as France abandoned the project. The project was a disaster. It quickly became obvious that a sea-level canal was impossible, and that building sets of locks leading to an elevated canal was the only workable plan. A dredge removes sediment after a landslide in the Culebra Cut. 1907. De Lesseps stubbornly stuck to the sea-level plan. Meanwhile, laborers and engineers were dying of malaria, yellow fever and dysentery, and construction was frustrated by frequent floods and mudslides. American engineers sent by President Roosevelt. 1908. By the time the raised locks plan was adopted, it was already too late. An estimated 22,000 workers had died. Earth is excavated at the site of the Gatton locks. 1907. The project was years behind schedule and hundreds of millions over budget. The company went bankrupt and collapsed, ruining 800,000 investors. A railroad is displaced after a landslide. 1910. De Lesseps was convicted of fraud and maladministration in 1893 and died in disgrace 2 years later following the deliberations of the U. A mosquito exterminator at work in the canal zone. 1910. Isthmian Canal Commission and a push from President Theodore Roosevelt, the U. A man stands on the west bank overlooking the construction of the Pedro Miguel locks. 1910. Purchased the French assets in the canal zone for $40 million in 1902. President William Howard Taft, left, visits the Gatton locks with Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, seated right, and Chief Engineer Colonel George Goethals, standing right. 1910. When a proposed treaty over rights to build in what was then a Colombian territory was rejected, the U.S. The Miraflores lower locks under construction. 1912. Through its military weight behind a Panamanian independence movement, eventually negotiating a deal with the new government on November 6, 1903, the United States recognized the Republic of Panama, and on November 18 the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty was signed with Panama, granting the U. A view of the Culebra Cut from the West Bank. 1912. Exclusive and permanent possession of the Panama Canal Zone. U.S. success hinged on two factors. First was converting the original French sea level plan to a more realistic lock-controlled canal. In exchange, Panama received $10 million and an annuity of $250,000 beginning 9 years later. The treaty, negotiated by U. A view of the upper locks of the Gatton locks, looking north toward the Atlantic Ocean. 1912. Secretary of State John Hay and French engineer Philippe Jean Bunau-Varilla was condemned by many Panamanians as an infringement on their country's new national sovereignty. One of the deepest points of the Culebra Cut. 1913. Contending with the same disease problems as the French, the Americans embarked on an aggressive mosquito extermination campaign. The link between malaria and mosquitoes was still a very new theory. By August 1907, 765,000 meters cubed, 1 million cubic yards, per month was being excavated. This set a record for the rainy season. Soon afterwards this doubled, before increasing again. At the peak of production, 2,300,000 meters cubed, 3 million cubic yards, were being excavated per month. This drastically reduced the instances of sickness and improved productivity after a few years contending with inadequate machinery and infrastructure. Excavation ramped up, and the canal began to take shape. One of the greatest barriers to a canal was the Continental Divide, which originally rose to 110 meters (360.9 feet) above sea level at its highest point. The effort to cut through this barrier of rock was one of the greatest challenges faced by the project. The Gatton Dam was built across the Changers River, creating Gatton Lake, the largest man-made lake at the time. The lake stretches across half the span of the Isthmus, carrying ships 21 miles in their traversal. The scale of the work was massive. 6,000 men worked in the cut, drilling holes in which a total of 27,000 t, 60 million pounds, of dynamite were placed to break up the rock, which was then removed by as many as 160 trains per day. Massive sets of locks were constructed at the Atlantic and Pacific ends of the canal. These 110-foot wide locks allowed ships to pass through a series of chambers with adjustable water levels, stepping up to the elevation of Gatton Lake and the canal, 85 feet, 26 meters, above sea level. Workers contend with the aftermath of a landslide. 1913. The greatest effort, though, was the Culebra Cut, a nearly 8-mile carving through the Culebra mountain ridge, which reached 210 feet 64 meters, above sea level. 27,000 metric tons of dynamite were used to blast apart over 100 million cubic yards of earth, which were carted away with steam shovels and trains. Workers take a break atop the canal locks. 1913. Due to a misjudgment of the composition of the geological strata, the excavation was plagued by unpredictable landslides, which sometimes took months to clear. By the time the cut was completed in 1913, the summit had been lowered from 210 feet (64 meters) above sea level to 39.12 meters. Trains and cranes intersect at the Pedro Miguel locks. 1913. On December 10, 1913, there was finally a traversable water route between the two oceans. Locks under construction. 1913. On Jan 7, 1914, the French crane boat Alexandre Lavallee made the first passage through the canal. Engineers stand in front of the massive gates of the canal locks. 1913. Today, 4% of all world trade passes through the canal, around 15,000 ships every year. Plans are underway to build an additional set of wider locks, as well as a competing canal through Nicaragua. The Gatton Locks under construction between the Atlantic Ocean and Gatton Lake. 1913. The largest toll ever charged for passage was $142,000 for a cruise ship. The smallest was $0. Men look on as dredges clear the results of a landslide at Cucaracha. 1914. 36. For adventurer Richard Halliburton, who swam the canal through the locks in 1928, bolstered by the addition of Gatton Dam in 1935. The Panama Canal proved a vital component to expanding global trade routes in the 20th century. The spillway of the Gatton Dam, which impounds man-made Gatton Lake, a major section of the canal. 1913. The transition to local oversight began with a 1977 treaty signed by U.S. The dike separating the canal from the Atlantic Ocean is blasted away. 1913. President Jimmy Carter and Panama leader Omar Torrijos, with the Panama Canal Authority assuming full control on December 31, 1999, recognized by the American Society of Civil Engineers as one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. In 1994, the canal hosted its 1 millionth passing ship in September 2010. The Panama Canal under construction. 1913. Photo credit, Bettman Corbis Getty.